This is a story worth every second of your time. Capitol Hill, 9 a.m. sharp. The House Oversight Committee room was overflowing. Lawmakers shoulder to shoulder, aides racing with binders, camera crews jammed in every corner. The brass plate on the oak doors read "Emergency Session," but the air inside felt more like a trial than a hearing. The chairman struck his gavel once. Loud, sharp, final. This hearing will come to order. Topic: Roe is dead. Who pays the price? The room fell into a silence that vibrated with unspoken outrage. Seated on opposite sides of the table were two women who defined the moment. On the left, Jasmine Crockett, fire-eyed, unforgiving, her legal mind sharpened by the stories of dying women denied care. On the right, Marjorie Dannenfelser, crisp navy suit, lips pressed in a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, the architect behind a movement that celebrated the fall of Roe v. Wade. They did not greet one another. They did not nod. They simply stared. The chairman read into the record. In 1973, Roe v. Wade recognized the constitutional right to abortion, preventing states from banning it outright. In 2022, Dobbs v. Jackson overturned that decision, ending federal protection and returning power to the states. Today, we confront the real-world cost. His words were ice on steel. No legal jargon could shield what came next. Behind Jasmine sat a row of sealed manila folders, each bearing a name, a date, and a state. Each one a woman. Some were patients, some were dead. Some were still waiting for someone to care. Behind Marjorie stood pages of speeches, faith-backed arguments, and smiling photos from rallies held on courthouse steps. The contrast was brutal. Jasmine's fingers tapped once on the table, her body still as stone. She wasn't here to argue law. She was here for the mothers turned away at ER doors, for the 10-year-olds flown across state lines, for the nurses who whispered, "I'm sorry," when the law said, "Let her bleed." And across from her, Marjorie waited, calm, resolved, unwavering, ready to justify it all in the name of moral clarity. This wasn't a debate. It wasn't about hypotheticals. It was about women, real ones. The room knew it. The nation would soon know it too. And when the chairman gave the floor to the first speaker, the oxygen in the room seemed to thin, because everyone knew who would take it first, and everyone knew she would strike like a blade pulled clean from the bone. Marjorie Dannenfelser adjusted her microphone with practiced elegance. Her voice, when it came, was smooth, measured, almost liturgical. "The overturning of Roe v. Wade," she began, "was not a setback. It was a restoration, the greatest human rights victory of the 21st century. For too long, our nation permitted the silent eradication of the unborn. Millions gone without a voice. But Dobbs gave the voiceless a future. It recentered our values. It reminded us that human dignity begins at conception. And for that, history will judge us kindly." A few heads in the room nodded. Others froze in place, waiting, bracing for what came next. Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't look down, didn't shuffle paper. She leaned in, her voice low, deliberate, each word cutting through the congressional hush like a scalpel. 12 women, she said. 12 confirmed deaths in just 6 months. Not from war, not from cancer, but from being denied treatment for ectopic pregnancies, from being told to wait until their bodies broke open before help would be legally allowed. She turned her head slowly, eyes locked on Marjorie like a rifle finding its mark. "And you call that humanity?" Her words didn't echo. They detonated. A gasp flickered through the gallery. Somewhere near the back, a woman's sob was muffled by her hand. Jasmine rose, not waiting for permission. She held up a photo, 8 by 10, glossy, clinical. A young woman, no older than 28, pale, eyes closed in an ICU bed, IV lines tangled around her wrists like unanswered pleas. Her name was Kira Samuels, Louisiana. She bled internally for 9 hours because doctors were too afraid of being prosecuted. Her family begged. Her uterus ruptured. She died before the ethics board could even vote. She placed the photo face up on the table between them. "Where in your theology does that belong?" Marjorie stiffened, lips parting, but no words forming. She reached for her papers, but found no defense on the page. Jasmine didn't let up. "You praised the ruling. I've seen the bodies. You worship the law. I've held the mothers. This isn't theory. It's triage. Her voice didn't crack. It rose. Controlled fury, judicial fire. You don't get to write off casualties just because they're inconvenient to your crusade. The chairman intervened, voice trembling slightly. Congresswoman Crockett, please remain on topic, she snapped. This is the topic. Who pays the price? Women like Kira, girls like Emily, nurses who break down crying in stairwells because the law told them to wait for a heartbeat that would never come. Don't tell me this is about values. This is about control dressed as virtue. And for a moment, no one, not even Marjorie, had the breath to respond. But Jasmine wasn't finished, and the room sensed it. What had begun as testimony was becoming something else entirely, a dismantling. Marjorie straightened her spine as if preparing to deliver scripture, not policy. Her voice, when it returned, was even and calm, each word shaped with careful intent. I know these stories are heartbreaking, she began, but they must not distract us from the deeper truth. Every fetus is a person, not a concept, not a clump of cells. A full, unique human being with its own DNA, its own heartbeat, and its own God-given rights. She folded her hands neatly, the corners of her lips tilting in a smile more resolved than warm. To deny fetal personhood is to deny human dignity at its most vulnerable. Dobbs gave us the chance to protect the voiceless. That is not oppression, that is moral clarity. There was no applause, no shift in tone, just a beat of quiet, a prelude to something sharper. Jasmine exhaled once, softly, but when she looked up, the steel in her eyes was unmistakable. So let me ask plainly, she said, her voice low but unflinching. If a fetus is a person, then what does that make the woman? Her question didn't ask for an answer. It tore the foundation out from under the room. Because right now, across this country, we're watching that idea weaponized, not to protect life, but to punish it. She leaned into the microphone, the folders beside her unopened but radiating weight. In Texas, a woman named Lizelle Herrera was arrested, charged with murder, after she sought medical help for a pregnancy loss. She didn't harm anyone. She didn't confess to anything. She was reported by hospital staff and taken out in handcuffs. Jasmine's voice didn't rise. It deepened, steadied, like someone who knows the gravity of what she's delivering. In Idaho, a woman was interrogated for ordering pills online after her doctor told her there was no heartbeat. She was 19, alone, bleeding in her dorm room. That's not care. That's surveillance. Her eyes scanned the committee table. This is not theory. This is the state stepping between a woman and her own blood and saying, you no longer get to decide what happens next. And if you miscarry, you better have a witness, you better have receipts, because grief in this America now comes with legal liability. She turned her gaze back to Marjorie, slow and steady, and let the words fall like iron. You call it fetal personhood. I call it institutionalized suspicion, where every uterus is a potential crime scene, and every woman is a preemptive suspect. There was no sound, no movement, just the truth, sitting in the center of the room like a stone dropped into deep water, its ripples still spreading, far from done. But Jasmine hadn't come to this hearing to trade ideology for ideology. She came to show exactly what happens when policy ignores the body and when law replaces care. She reached slowly into the stack beside her and withdrew a plain white folder with a red tag and a federal seal stamped in the corner. Her voice was steady, but something colder now sat behind it, a controlled fury. This document is from the Department of Health and Human Services, she said, holding it up just enough for the cameras to catch the title, Post-Dobbs Emergency Outcomes Report. She opened it with care, not performance. She wanted the words to speak for themselves. Across 21 states with full or partial abortion bans, we have recorded a 37% rise in obstetric emergencies. She paused. Not office visits, not blood pressure spikes, emergencies. Her words now landed like nails in wood. Women arriving with ruptured amniotic sacs, women denied care for miscarriages in progress, women hemorrhaging in hospital hallways while lawyers were called instead of surgeons. She turned the page and held up a graph, sharp red bars leaping off the page. This spike began within weeks of the Dobbs ruling, and it hasn't dropped. Her voice remained low, but each word thudded with weight. These aren't numbers. These are patients. And the story behind every data point is a woman who had to wait, not for help, but for permission. She placed the report down gently, as though it might catch fire from the truth it held. Then she opened a second folder. This one's slimmer, grayer. Now let's talk about the cost to the people trying to save them. She pulled out 4 printed profiles, each with a headshot and brief summary. Her fingers ran across the names slowly, like reading memorial plaques. Dr. Karen Hughes, Dr. Nina Patel, Dr. Samuel Reyes, Dr. Lisa Bowman. All 4 are board-certified OBGYNs. All 4 provided abortion care only in cases where the mother's life was clearly at risk. All 4 followed the medical standard of care, and all 4 were fired. Her gaze rose again, burning without raising her voice. Not disciplined, not reviewed, fired. In some cases, escorted out of their hospitals under threat of criminal investigation, for doing what any doctor with a conscience would have done. She lifted one photo, a middle-aged black woman in a surgical gown, smiling beside a NICU team. This is Dr. Hughes, 22 years in practice. She removed a non-viable fetus from a woman going septic, only to be reported by hospital administrators because the fetal heartbeat hadn't officially stopped yet. By the time ethics cleared her action, she had already been placed on administrative leave. She was never reinstated. Jasmine set the photo down softly, as though honoring something sacred. Then her tone turned to steel. If this is what protecting life looks like, losing doctors, watching women deteriorate while legal departments debate viability, then what exactly are we protecting? She didn't yell. She didn't need to. The numbers had spoken. The names had spoken. And so had the silence of those no longer here to speak for themselves. The room should have been still with grief, but instead it tensed as Marjorie once again reached for the one refuge that had kept her movement alive for decades. Doubt. She leaned forward slightly, her expression composed, but her words cloaked in intellectual distance. Let me be clear, she said, eyes shifting from Jasmine to the chairman. I do not deny that there are painful stories, but these claims of doctors being unable to act, of women dying because of legal uncertainty, remain scientifically inconclusive. There's no definitive peer-reviewed evidence tying these incidents directly to post-Dobbs restrictions. Medical outcomes are complex. It would be irresponsible to draw sweeping conclusions from isolated events. Her voice was soft, almost apologetic, but each phrase carved away urgency like a scalpel held too gently. Anecdote is not data, she added, folding her notes with meticulous calm. Jasmine didn't respond with words, not at first. She didn't raise her voice or shake her head. Instead, she reached down, opened a navy blue folder, and lifted a tablet from within, black, silent, unassuming. She held it up for a moment, then her voice came low and tight. You want data? Fine. But before data, there's reality. And reality bled out on a hospital bed while policy waited for proof. She tapped the screen. This was recorded with consent. It's not hearsay. It's not a headline. It's the final words of a woman who died because the law told her doctors to wait. The video flickered to life on the committee's screen. A young woman lay in a hospital gown, face slick with sweat, eyes searching the ceiling as if clinging to something just beyond the fluorescent lights. Her voice came broken, carried on shallow breaths. If I die here, please tell my daughter, I didn't choose this. I asked for help. They said it wasn't time yet, that there was still a heartbeat. But I can feel it. I'm going. I know my body. I know it's shutting down. She coughed violently, then whispered, please tell her I didn't give up. Tell her I begged them. The screen froze on her face. 29 years old, still and glassy-eyed, the oxygen tube askew on her cheek. The room remained silent. No one moved. Jasmine placed the tablet down slowly, both palms resting flat on the table as if steadying the entire world. Her voice came softer now, but so clear it cut through every breath in the chamber. Her name was Lena Price. She had a 5-year-old daughter named Naomi. Lena was diagnosed with an incomplete miscarriage at 16 weeks. Her uterus was already compromised. Her OBGYN recommended emergency removal. But because there was still cardiac activity, just flickers on the monitor. Hospital policy, rewritten after Dobbs, barred intervention. She stepped away from the table now, eyes locked on the committee. So they waited. They waited until her blood pressure dropped below 80, until her lips turned blue, until they were allowed legally to treat her as dying. And by then, it was too late. Her tone didn't rise. It went deeper, stripped of everything but truth. This is not fear-mongering. It's not theoretical. It's a voice, one we can never hear again. Not because medicine failed, because the law wouldn't let it act in time. She paused, not for effect, but because the words that followed demanded breath. You call for more evidence. I brought her voice. You say anecdotes aren't enough. I say death should be. The silence that followed wasn't stunned. It was mourning. The room hadn't yet recovered from the echo of a dying woman's final words. And that's precisely when Jasmine moved in. Her voice didn't rise. It narrowed. She turned toward Marjorie with the steadiness of a prosecutor approaching the stand. Her tone sharpened not by anger, but by something colder. Memory. You've said you don't believe women should be punished for seeking abortions. You've said it's about compassion, that no one wants to see a mother put in jail. Jasmine let the words hang in the air just long enough to feel like a challenge, not a quote. But in 2011, Jenny Lynn McCormack was arrested in Pocatello, Idaho. A single mother of 3, living in poverty, she was charged with a felony for taking abortion pills at home after she couldn't afford the trip to Salt Lake City. She paused, her gaze unwavering. She wasn't a political operative. She wasn't a symbol. She was a woman trying to survive. And the state came for her, not the doctor, not the supplier, her. Jasmine stepped slightly closer to the table, her hands resting on the folder she had been waiting to open. And when that happened, Ms. Dannenfelser, where were you? Her voice lowered a fraction. Because I looked. There was no public statement, no interview, no denouncement of the charges, nothing. Marjorie didn't respond. Her body remained still, but the stillness no longer resembled composure. It felt like retreat. The silence that followed wasn't strategic. It was the absence of defense. Jasmine slowly opened the folder and held up a court filing. The official complaint against McCormack, stamped and signed. This is the charge she faced: violating Idaho's 1972 statute criminalizing self-managed abortions, a law so outdated it predated Roe v. Wade, a law that hadn't been enforced in decades, until her. She looked to the committee members now, her voice cool but resonant. This wasn't about protecting life. The pregnancy was non-viable. There was no heartbeat. It was about sending a message to women too poor to leave town. She turned her eyes back to Marjorie, and the next words landed like a slow, hard truth. You had the power to speak, to say, this is not the future we want. This is not justice. But you said nothing, and silence when it comes from someone who claims moral authority isn't neutrality. It's complicity. Jasmine didn't sit yet. She let the silence do its work. Because in that moment, the hearing had shifted, no longer about politics or law or headlines. It had become something heavier, a moral ledger, and Jasmine Crockett had just opened it, line by line. Until now, Jasmine had spoken of victims, data, and silence. But now her target was not just what Marjorie defended. It was how willingly she had traded truth for convenience. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't lean forward. Instead, Jasmine simply tapped the small black remote in her hand, and the screens behind her lit up with flickering news footage. The video was grainy, a side-room interview from the 2016 campaign trail. Marjorie Dannenfelser appeared on screen, seated stiffly in front of a dark blue curtain, microphone in hand. Her voice was clipped, measured, firm. Donald Trump is not a reliable ally to the pro-life cause. He's unpredictable, unprincipled, and frankly, dangerous. The timestamp glowed at the bottom, September 2016. Jasmine let the clip run a few more seconds. He doesn't understand the values we fight for, and if he wins, it could set this movement back years. The video cut. The silence in the chamber was instant and heavy. Jasmine didn't look at Marjorie, not yet. She pressed the button again. The second video lit the room brighter. This time, it was a campaign rally stage in 2020. Red, white, and blue banners, flags, chants in the background. Marjorie stood behind a podium bearing the Trump logo, her voice ringing out across the sound system with unwavering conviction. President Trump is the most pro-life president in American history. Applause thundered in the background. She raised her hand as if delivering gospel. He has kept every promise. He has stood by us, and we must stand by him. The screen froze on her image, eyes bright, smiling, clapping. Jasmine finally turned to her, voice low but exact. That was you. Same woman. 4 years apart. Two entirely different truths. She placed the remote down carefully. In 2016, you called him erratic, a threat. You questioned his integrity. But by 2020, he had delivered Supreme Court seats, and suddenly, he was your hero. She took one step closer. Her voice didn't change, but something in the room did. So I want to ask you directly, and I want a straight answer. What changed? She gave the question weight, not volume. Was it your convictions, or was it his power? Marjorie didn't respond. She didn't blink. But the stillness no longer read as composure. It read as calculation. Jasmine continued, eyes unwavering. Because when he mocked women, you stayed. When he paid hush money to cover up affairs, you stayed. When he suggested jailing women for abortions, you stayed. And now you call him the greatest pro-life president in history. She leaned in slightly, not aggressively, but close enough to make the moment intimate, personal, inescapable. So tell us, Ms. Dannenfelser, was it values that led you to him, or was it victory? The silence that followed was not empty. It was damning. As the room exhaled and the gavel called for recess, what no one realized was that the real testimony, the one that wouldn't be sworn but whispered, was already waiting in the hallway, carrying a truth no hearing had yet dared to record. The hallway outside room 223B was quieter than it should have been. Capitol Hill hallways are rarely still. There's always movement, murmurs, footfalls. But in the brief recess following Jasmine Crockett's cross-examination, the air had turned dense, almost reluctant to move. Staffers spoke in low tones. Reporters paced, checking notes and whispering into headsets. Jasmine stood just beyond the doorway, her expression unreadable. Her body was still, but her mind was clearly in motion, replaying every question, every hesitation, every silence from Marjorie Dannenfelser, like chess pieces being reshuffled for the second half of a match. That's when she felt it, a light touch on her arm, gentle, deliberate. She turned quickly, not startled, but aware. Standing just to her left was a young woman, maybe 25 at most, dressed in a plain navy blouse tucked into a gray skirt, a lanyard around her neck identifying her only as a congressional visitor. Her posture was tight, shoulders drawn inward, eyes darting just once toward the press cluster down the corridor before locking on Jasmine's. Congresswoman Crockett, the young woman whispered, voice low, dry like it hadn't been used all day. I need 30 seconds, please. Jasmine's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes sharpened, just slightly. She stepped closer, putting her body between the woman and any potential eavesdroppers. Talk, she said quietly. The woman glanced again toward the doorway, then leaned in closer, her words quick but controlled. I volunteered for Susan B. Anthony Pro-Life America during the 2020 cycle. I worked under Marjorie's national outreach team in a regional communications pod. Jasmine blinked once. So she's internal, her mind registered. Not some protester, not a plant, not bluffing. Go on. The woman took a breath, her voice trembling now. They knew. They absolutely knew people were threatening clinics. Not just protest signs or angry calls. Real threats, coordinated, directed at doctors, at nurses, at their families. Jasmine didn't react. Not yet. She'd learned a long time ago that the most dangerous thing you could do with a truth this heavy was to handle it too fast. What kind of threats? She asked. Targeted doxing. Late-night calls to spouses, letters sent to homes with pictures of bloodied fetuses, telling OBGYNs they were being watched. One doctor in Ohio had her tires slashed after refusing to delay a medically necessary D&C. The woman swallowed hard. We got an internal memo telling us not to forward media reports about it. Just flag them and delete. Jasmine tilted her head slightly. You're saying the leadership of SBA knew about all this and didn't act? The woman's voice dropped even lower. They didn't just know. They coordinated with at least one of the groups responsible. That was when Jasmine's entire posture changed. No longer cautious, now fully still, fully locked in. Who? The woman reached into her messenger bag, fingers trembling now. Not theatrically, but like someone who had been waiting for months to make this decision and still wasn't sure if it would get her fired, blacklisted, or worse. She pulled out a small black USB drive. Standard, no label. There's a group called Life Sentinels. Sounds harmless. They position themselves as community defenders for unborn children. But their private emails, these emails, are something else. They discuss protest targets. They share hospital schedules. They talk about applying maximum social pressure to abortion providers and anyone who supports them. Jasmine took the drive slowly, carefully, like it was radioactive, which in some sense it was. What's on this? 37 email threads between mid-2020 and early 2022. Most are between regional SBA organizers and the Sentinel's lead coordinator. Some CC Marjorie directly. They talk about coordinating rallies, sharing lists of hospital administrators, making sure the doctors feel us at their doorsteps. One email from November 2021 actually celebrates the resignation of an OB/GYN who performed emergency abortions in a Mississippi trauma center. It says, quote, "Our pressure campaign worked. We sent a message." The woman's voice cracked slightly at the end. Not for effect, just exhaustion. Jasmine said nothing. She stared at the drive for another full second, then looked up. "Will you testify?" The woman didn't hesitate, but she didn't agree either. "Not with my name. I'm already on thin ice. And if they know I leaked this..." Her breath hitched. "I've seen what they do to people they think are disloyal." Jasmine nodded once. "We can do it under seal. Pseudonym, closed-door deposition, protected status. I've handled bigger and louder than them." The woman paused, then nodded. The kind of nod you give when you've just set something in motion you can't take back. "Thank you," she said. Jasmine looked at her, not like a politician looking at a source, but like a woman recognizing another woman who had been asked to carry too much for too long. "No," she said softly. "Thank you for trusting the right person." The young woman turned and walked quickly down the hallway, back into the anonymity of Capitol Hill's shadows. Jasmine watched her go, then turned the USB drive over in her hand. It was light, plastic, unassuming, but inside it could be a match or a bomb. Aide footsteps clicked nearby. The door to the hearing room reopened. The second half was about to begin. But now Jasmine had something no one else in that room did. Not just data, not just emotion, not just questions. She had proof. And for the first time that day, Marjorie Dannenfelser wouldn't just be sitting in that hearing as a witness. She'd be sitting under oath, with the truth closing in. When Jasmine Crockett stepped back into the hearing room, she was no longer just a congresswoman with questions. She was a witness, a prosecutor, and the keeper of a truth the room had spent all morning trying not to see. She moved with quiet force, every step toward her seat echoing louder than the gavel had earlier that day. The committee had reconvened, but the energy in the room had changed. Staffers were alert. Reporters leaned forward. Even members of the panel sat straighter, sensing a shift they couldn't yet name. Jasmine didn't glance at Marjorie. She didn't need to. Her focus was locked on the console in front of her, where the USB drive now waited. Small, black, unremarkable, and about to detonate everything that had been said. She inserted the drive. The main monitor clicked to life, and lines of text began to appear. Not summarized, not redacted. Original internal emails. Sender, recipient, date, subject line. Jasmine didn't speak for the first few seconds. She let the room absorb what they were seeing. No spin, no translation. just words sent by real people behind closed doors, never meant to be seen by the public or by Congress. Then she spoke. These are communications between members of Susan B. Anthony Pro-Life America's regional leadership and an affiliated entity known as the Life Sentinels. She began, voice composed, deliberate. The organization describes itself as a grassroots volunteer group. What these emails show is something far more coordinated and far more dangerous. She advanced the screen to an August 2021 email sent from a senior SBA field director to the Sentinels. She read it aloud, every word clear, undeniable. Apply social pressure by any means necessary. Letters, calls, in-person visits. Be visible. Be persistent. Make physicians feel the moral weight of their decisions. If they leave, better for the country. The chamber didn't stir, but the silence began to tighten, as if everyone had stopped breathing at once. Here's another, Jasmine continued. September 3rd, 2021. Subject line, shifting the medical culture. The screen shifted. A highlighted section expanded. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She lowered it, and somehow it hit even harder. Begin outreach to religious leaders near facilities offering abortion services. Encourage them to challenge the moral status of doctors in sermons and private meetings. Build pressure across professional and spiritual lines. If a few practitioners exit the field, that's a small price to pay for restoring national conscience. Jasmine stepped away from the podium now, giving the emails space to linger in the air. She turned slowly to face the committee and the public gallery behind them. What you're looking at is not just an email. It's a strategy, a system, one designed not to protect life, but to punish those who save it. Her voice grew more precise, not louder. Let's be clear. These emails do not encourage debate. They do not seek understanding. They call for moral pressure, not in words, but in acts. Acts that push doctors to the edge of fear. Acts that turn hospitals into ideological war zones. She turned toward Marjorie now. Finally. The tension between them was now a living thing in the room. Ms. Dannenfelser, these were your people. Your communications team. Your allies. At what point does oversight become approval? At what point does silence become complicity? Marjorie sat still. Her expression was unreadable, but something in her posture had shifted. Not shaken, but no longer quite so square. Jasmine turned back to the screen and showed one last email. Dated November 2021. The words were circled in red. If doctors feel heat, good. If they lose patience, better. If they walk away, we win. The sentence hung in the air like a final breath. Jasmine didn't dramatize it. She didn't look for applause. She stepped back to the microphone, hands flat on the table. This is not about abortion. This is not about religion. This is about the use of coordinated fear to drive trained, licensed, life-saving physicians out of their calling. It's about intimidating nurses until they're afraid to act. It's about redefining medical ethics through back-channel pressure and public silence. She let the screen fade to black. The USB drive was still in the console, humming softly. Then she asked the only question that mattered. If the moral authority you claim requires people to lose their jobs, their safety, their voice, then whose morality is it really? The monitors had dimmed, but the words were still echoing. The room hadn't breathed properly in minutes. Eyes shifted, not toward Jasmine, but toward the woman who had, until now, remained a fortress of calm behind a porcelain smile. Marjorie straightened her back, a subtle stiffness betraying that the weight of the emails was heavier than her rehearsed demeanor could mask. Let me be very clear, she said, each syllable trimmed of warmth. I do not agree with the language used in those emails. It does not reflect the official position of our organization. She paused, expecting that to suffice, but it didn't. Jasmine leaned forward, not to interrupt, but to listen with surgical stillness, as if waiting for something real, something human. None came, so Jasmine rose. No notes, no hesitation, just the calm fury of someone who had seen too many lives treated like collateral. With all due respect, Ms. Dannenfelser, she began, her voice low but thick with moral weight. This is not about tone. This is not about a poor choice of words in an internal memo. This is about women, real women, bleeding in silence while your organization nods behind closed doors. She held up a photograph, a young OBGYN from Texas who had left her practice after receiving death threats. This doctor received 37 voicemails in 1 week, not one of them from your group, but all of them inspired by your campaigns. Her hand trembled slightly, not from fear but from restraint, as she laid the photo on the table. You want to distance yourself from the wording? Fine, but show me where you condemn the intent. Show me the press release, the tweet, the whisper, anything. Her voice broke, just enough to sound human, just enough to carry the weight of the women no longer able to speak for themselves. You can disown the words, Marjorie, but you cannot disown the silence. She leaned in, the room hanging on every breath. Because silence is not neutrality. Silence is complicity. And when women are dying, silence is violence dressed in pearls and prayer. No rebuttal came, only the sound of truth settling into the air like judgment. When the final email faded from the screen and Jasmine's voice retreated into silence, it was clear the chamber had reached its boiling point. But just before the pressure could be released, the doors cracked open again, ushering in not noise, but something heavier, truth in its smallest, most unexpected form. She walked in like a ghost, thin frame, oversized hoodie, shoes scuffed from too many quiet miles. She didn't look like a headline or a threat, just a girl. But as she stepped toward the center aisle, dragging every eye in the room with her, something inside the atmosphere shifted, like the oxygen had been exchanged for glass. The chairman glanced toward Crockett, puzzled. She gave a single, nearly imperceptible nod. The chairman leaned forward, eyebrows raised. Is this your witness? Jasmine rose slowly. Mr. Chairman, she said, voice steady, with the committee's consent, I'd like to introduce an unscheduled speaker, someone whose life was altered by the very policies under discussion today. The girl didn't sit right away. She took a moment to steady her breath. The microphone waited like a coiled wire. Her name was Lily. That's what the record would call her. Just Lily. No last name, no city. She had chosen anonymity, but not invisibility. Not anymore. I'm here, she began, because I wasn't supposed to be. Her voice was quiet but unnervingly clear. It rang through the marble-paneled room like it belonged there. Because it did. I'm 15. I live in Ohio. I go to school. I used to play violin. That changed. She paused, gripping the edge of the table. Something happened to me last year. I'm not going to describe it, because I shouldn't have to. But what came after was worse in some ways. Not the physical part. The decisions, the silence, the fact that people like you, she looked toward the witness stand, wrote laws that treated my body like it belonged to the state. Someone shifted in their seat. No one spoke. I became pregnant. I didn't want to be. I didn't ask for it. I was scared. And then I was told that no one in my state could help me unless I was dying. A long breath. I wasn't dying yet, so they told me to wait. The silence deepened. But we couldn't wait. My mom found someone who would take us in Illinois. We drove 9 hours in the middle of the night. I missed 3 days of school. We borrowed money. And when I got there, the doctor said if we'd waited another week, I might have needed surgery. Or worse. Her voice cracked, but didn't break. Why am I telling you this? Because you don't see us. You talk about babies and morality, but you don't talk about what it means for someone like me. You don't talk about how I have to live after. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded sonogram. Not to shock, to testify. This is from that clinic. I keep it. To remind myself I survived. A tear ran down her cheek and she let it. I'm not ashamed. I'm angry. I didn't do anything wrong. But somehow I'm the one who had to cross state lines in the dark, whisper secrets to strangers, and hope they believed I was worth helping. Her voice lowered. If I had stayed, I might not be here. The room froze. Even the camera shutters seemed to pause. Lily continued, but now with a new clarity, like something had crystallized inside her. I don't want to be part of anyone's campaign or platform. I don't need a hero. I just want to be left alone to be a kid, to heal. And I want people like me to be seen, not as cautionary tales, but as human beings. She turned slightly, not toward Jasmine, but toward Marjorie. You say this is about life, but mine almost ended. The words hit with the precision of a courtroom closing argument, not shouted, delivered. Then, without fanfare, Lily folded the ultrasound, stood up, and left the hearing room the way she came, quiet, unguarded, with no security detail, no entourage, and no applause. But her absence screamed louder than her presence ever could. The chairman didn't gavel for recess. No one dared move. Jasmine remained still, her fingers resting gently on the wood of the desk, as if anchoring herself to reality. Marjorie sat rigid, her hands curled into fists on her lap. She looked down, not in defeat, but in calculation. It wasn't the story she expected to defend against. A child with no agenda had just said what no legal brief or Senate speech ever could, that there is a cost to every crusade, and sometimes that cost is borne by those too young to vote, too small to fight, and too brave to stay quiet. Jasmine didn't speak again right away. She didn't need to, because for the first time since the hearing began, the room finally understood. This wasn't about theory, it was about consequences, about names and faces and traumas tucked between state lines and policy memos. And once you've seen that kind of truth, you can't unsee it. As the committee recessed and the heavy doors sealed behind Lily, the silence she left behind began to metastasize, not only inside the chamber, but in every newsroom, living room, and digital feed across the country. What she had said couldn't be unheard, and what followed couldn't be stopped. It began with a single local reporter outside the committee room, still catching her breath, voice trembling as she summarized the morning's hearing for a midday broadcast. The camera cut to her just as Lily's testimony ended. Her words were simple. A child just gave the country a moral reckoning. If you weren't in the room, you need to pay attention now. Within 90 minutes, the hearing footage, particularly the moment Lily held up the blurry black and white image, made its way to every national network. CNN looped the clip with only ambient music in the background. MSNBC ran a full contextual breakdown, including the timeline of the law in Ohio that forced the girl to flee across state lines. Even Fox News, reluctant at first, eventually aired a heavily edited version of the moment, followed by a visibly uncomfortable panel scrambling to reframe it. But the impact was already irreversible. By mid-afternoon, every major newspaper updated their front-page headlines. The Washington Post called it "The Day the Debate Changed." Politico ran an urgent bulletin from Capitol Hill, citing staffers who described the hearing as the most emotionally devastating in years. NBC, ABC, CBS all followed with wall-to-wall coverage. Inside their newsrooms, something had shifted. Producers began pulling old clips of Jasmine's previous hearings, her clashes with judges, her confrontations with power. For years, she had been cast as a firebrand, a disruptor. Now they framed her as a reluctant crusader, one who didn't seek the moment but was clearly built for it. And at the center of it all was a child, a girl with shaking hands and defiant eyes, holding a sonogram and speaking about mortality. Late that night, a long-form op-ed published in The Atlantic stunned even the most jaded readers. Written by an anonymous pediatric ER doctor from Indiana, it recounted an eerily similar case. A 12-year-old collapsed in pain, turned away by two hospitals, eventually airlifted. But too late. The doctor's closing line hit like a hammer. When politics rewrites medical ethics, it's not law, it's cruelty in costume. Behind the scenes, pressure was mounting. Lawyers for Susan B. Anthony Pro-Life America, once smug in their legal distance, were now in emergency meetings. Internal emails, obtained and verified through encrypted sources, confirmed what Jasmine had already made public. Conversations between staffers and extremist groups that advocated for targeted social disruption of doctors, hospital boards, and clinics. The phrase, strategic intimidation, appeared 5 times across the emails. One message, sent at 2:43 a.m. from a junior aide, had simply said, "We can't keep pretending we don't know." And then came the public statement, dry, mechanical, preemptively defensive. Our organization affirms its long-standing position against violence or coercion, We categorically reject any affiliation with fringe activist groups. We support peaceful advocacy and legislative change. But no one was convinced, because it wasn't just about policy anymore. It was about proof, about choices made behind closed doors, and the consequences that played out on operating tables, in emergency rooms, in the hushed aftermath of ambulance sirens that came too late. By the second day, national pressure was in full throttle. Journalists began to dig deeper into the history of Life Sentinels, the group exposed in the email chain. What they uncovered was chilling. Years of online forums, encrypted message chains, private donor networks. Former members came forward anonymously. Some described being told to stand outside hospitals and document which doctors entered abortion clinics. Others recalled being encouraged to send anonymous threats. One whistleblower described a training session where attendees were told, "The law won't save us. Fear will." Suddenly, the line between belief and extremism had a face, and that face stood dangerously close to Marjorie Dannenfelser. The Republican presidential candidate for whom she had served as policy architect tried to distance himself. First through silence, then through his communications director, who told a reporter off camera, "She's off the campaign. That's all I can say." Hours later, it was confirmed. Marjorie had been removed from her role as chief advisor on reproductive policy. There was no public statement from her, no interview, no rebuttal. For the first time in over a decade, her voice vanished from the Sunday talk show circuit, her usual interviews pulled, her quotes scrubbed from campaign websites. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett stood on the steps of the Capitol, not gloating, not triumphant, but steady. When a reporter asked her what came next, she answered, "Accountability. Not just for the policymakers, for the silence, for the threats, for every girl who thought she was alone until now." In a small conference room a few blocks away, a group of young aides reviewed footage of the hearing for a documentary project. One paused the video at the moment Lily said, "If I kept the baby, we might have both died." The still image hung on the screen. No one spoke for nearly a full minute. They didn't need to. Across the country, pediatric clinics received letters of support. Doctors long silenced by fear spoke publicly for the first time. A small town in Illinois held a candlelight vigil, not just for Lily but for others like her, those whose stories were buried under statutes and shame. And yet none of this had started with legislation or legal briefs. It had started with a child, then a folder, then a name, and one woman who refused to look away. The hearing room had emptied, but the nation was still holding its breath. What began as a congressional clash had spilled into the bloodstream of American conscience. By the time Jasmine Crockett stepped out under the afternoon sun, the Capitol dome rising like a shadow behind her, she wasn't just a congresswoman. She was the echo of 1,000 unheard voices, and she knew the cameras were rolling. She stood before a chaotic press swarm outside the Capitol, reporters jostling, flashes erupting like gunfire, boom mics trembling in the breeze. The podium bore no seal, no protective barrier separated her from the moment. Jasmine Crockett faced them alone, sleeves rolled, eyes unflinching. The silence before she spoke was not hesitation. It was precision. "This is not about Marjorie," she began, her voice low but firm, slicing clean through the noise. "It never was. This is about something far older and far more dangerous than one person. It's about the culture that uses morality like a leash." Every word landed like a verdict. A culture that claims to protect life, but only once it has power over yours. A culture that calls itself righteous while women bleed out in parking lots. She didn't look at notes. There were none. We've watched people hide behind faith while funding silence. We've seen lawmakers praise God from a pulpit and then dodge every question about a dying girl from Ohio. She paused just long enough for her eyes to scan the sea of cameras. "You can call it conviction, but I've seen what it really is. It's fear. Fear that if women decide for themselves, your illusion of control crumbles." A reporter asked if this was personal. Jasmine didn't smile. "It's personal because I've held the hand of someone forced to carry pain for the comfort of others." Her voice cracked, but not with weakness. It was the kind of crack that happens before a dam breaks. "It's personal because I've seen a nurse whisper, 'I'm sorry, we can't touch her yet,' while the law watched her die." She leaned slightly forward. And now you ask me if I'm angry? I'm beyond angry. I'm focused. The crowd stilled. No one interrupted. The question isn't whether I'm at war with Marjorie. The question is whether we're finally willing to admit what this fight actually is. A battle between the performance of virtue and the preservation of life. Behind her, an aide adjusted a microphone cord, pale and shaking. Jasmine didn't flinch. They used to burn women like me for being too loud, too smart, too unwilling to kneel. Now they just pass laws and call it tradition. Her hands clenched slightly at the edge of the podium. Let me be clear. If standing up for girls who are too young to testify makes me dangerous in their eyes, I'll wear that threat like armor. A final pause. Then the line that would lead every broadcast that evening. This was never about saving lives. It's always been about controlling them. And I won't stop until that grip is broken. As Crockett stepped out of the Capitol's shadow into a nation forever altered by her testimony, the ripple she set in motion became a tidal wave, one that would now crash into the very institutions that allowed silence to become policy. Within 48 hours, the House Judiciary Subcommittee on Civil Liberties called for an emergency investigation. What had begun as a confrontation between two political figures now threatened to unveil the hidden machinery behind American reproductive policy. The room where the inquiry was held, room 2141 of the Rayburn House office building, had seen its share of battles. But that morning it felt like a courtroom for the soul of the country. The walls bore portraits of lawmakers long gone, silent witnesses to a reckoning they never imagined. Staffers rushed to set up projectors, document troves were wheeled in under tarps, and security doubled outside the chamber. Not for fear of violence, but because truth, at this level, often drew desperate defenders. A single banner hung at the back. Public policy must serve public good. The irony was bitter. Congresswoman Crockett was not seated at the table this time. She was in the gallery, an observer, a trigger, a symbol. Instead, former state legislators, health professionals, and a whistleblower from inside a major pro-life lobbying organization took the witness stand. The first witness, Dr. Elaine Monroe, pulled out a ledger of anonymous patient testimonies, women forced across state lines, OB/GYNs resigning under threat, and hospitals turning away emergencies due to fear of criminal liability. They call it moral leadership, she said, her voice shaking, but it's just controlled fear wrapped in scripture. The committee room didn't move. Even the lights seemed to dim. There was no outrage left to perform, only stunned absorption. The whistleblower, identified only as Mr. L, revealed that over $42 million had been funneled from 3 tax-exempt nonprofit groups directly into state campaigns, each demanding legislative loyalty in return. Screens lit up with maps showing synchronized bill introductions across multiple legislatures. Matching phrases, matching timing, matching donors. This wasn't democracy, he said, as digital lines connected lobbyist memos to gubernatorial endorsements. It was a corporate colonization of women's autonomy. When asked why he came forward now, he simply said, "Because no one came for my sister when she begged." His voice cracked. The silence that followed was heavier than any gavel. By mid-afternoon, a previously sealed subpoenaed cache was projected on the main screen. It contained internal strategy decks from a consulting firm hired by a faith-aligned think tank. The slides were brutal in clarity. Reframe reproductive control as national identity preservation. Use fear of cultural decline to push emergency policy through State House. One line, bold, underlined, froze the room. Liberty can be sacrificed temporarily for moral clarity. That sentence, once hidden behind passwords and private Zooms, now blazed across federal records. No one looked away. Some looked down. The climax came when Congresswoman Lillian Rhodes, a veteran lawmaker who had long stood at the sidelines on abortion debates, stood to address the room. She was 72, a moderate, a centrist, a compromiser. But not today. She placed both hands on the witness table and leaned forward. "We were elected to guard liberty, not mortgage it to whoever writes the largest check," she said. "This isn't just about abortion anymore. It's about whether democracy is still breathing through a woman's lungs." She turned her head slowly, looking each of her colleagues in the eye. Some winced, some nodded, some pretended to take notes. Then, the final moment came. Congressman Ramirez, a quiet first-term representative from Arizona, requested to speak. He had barely spoken in prior sessions, but today his words cut through like a scalpel. He leaned into his microphone, his voice calm and deliberate. "I have just one question," he said. He held up a black and white photo of a woman holding her newborn, wrapped in blankets from a hospital that no longer performed emergency abortions. If a woman cannot choose what happens to her own body, then tell me, when did American freedom die? There was no rebuttal, no procedural objection, no sound at all. Just that question, echoing through the chamber, through every news feed, into dinner tables and dorm rooms and hospitals across the nation. And outside on the steps of Congress, Jasmine Crockett stood in the cold evening light, watching, waiting, knowing full well that no matter how loud the gavel struck, some truths needed a witness, not just a verdict. The air outside Congress felt different that night, thick with the weight of something irreversible. What began as a political hearing had transformed into something far deeper, something ancestral. It wasn't about statutes or sound bites anymore. It was about the human soul colliding with the machinery of power and refusing to be erased. Jasmine Crockett had entered that room with documents, evidence, and a plan. But what she carried beneath her blazer, rage, memory, and moral clarity, became the real weapon. She had not come to win an argument. She had come to reclaim ground long stolen. And in doing so, she didn't just stand for the women in the headlines. She stood for every girl whose choices were stolen in silence, every mother who buried truth to survive, and every woman who'd ever been told that her freedom must come second to someone else's fear. There was no applause. There were no victory speeches. But across the country, in living rooms, in hospital break rooms, in college dorms and shelter basements, people watched her and understood something they hadn't dared to name aloud. That in America, the battle for control of a woman's body was never just about policy. It was about punishment. And Jasmine had dared to flip the script. She held up the mirror and forced the nation to look, not at her, but at itself. And what stared back wasn't a debate. It was a reckoning. One that asked, how long can you call yourself free when half your people live under conditions they didn't choose? This is the lesson we avoid because it terrifies us. That freedom is not permanent. It can be papered over by laws, corrupted by lobbying, and destroyed. Not in dramatic gestures, but in quiet votes and whispered backroom promises. Jasmine didn't come to make noise. She came to tear down the illusion that morality is neutral, that it can be dictated by the powerful without cost to the powerless. She exposed the rot beneath the polished floorboards, showed that in America it is entirely possible to speak of liberty while legislating control. She didn't cry, she didn't plead. She let the evidence speak, then let the silence finish the sentence. And in that silence, millions heard something new and horrifyingly familiar. Because here is the bitter truth. Injustice doesn't always wear a hood or carry a torch. Sometimes it sits in office. Sometimes it preys on camera. Sometimes it smiles and tells you it's for your own good. Jasmine knew that, and she fought anyway. Not with anger, but with purpose. Each question like a blade, each fact like a spark. She forced open a door long bolted shut, and behind that door was the truth we never wanted to face, that what's legal is not always what's right, and what's popular is not always what's just. So what now? What do we take from the storm she unleashed? The easy answer is outrage, but outrage fades. What must remain is vigilance, a new understanding that silence isn't neutral, that neutrality in times of oppression is a choice to side with the status quo. Jasmine didn't just model courage, she modeled accountability. And not just for politicians, for citizens, for systems, for all of us who've ever thought, this doesn't affect me. Because one day it might, and when it does, we'll remember her. The woman who stared down power and didn't blink. Her final question still echoes, not just in the halls of Congress, but in the hearts of those watching. If a woman can't decide what happens to her own body, then where exactly did America lose its freedom? It wasn't a rhetorical question. It was a line drawn in moral sand, a warning flare, and maybe, just maybe, the start of a long overdue shift. Not just in law, but in conscience. Because freedom is not given, it is demanded. And Jasmine Crockett reminded a nation, one painful truth at a time, that it's time to start demanding again. But a reckoning, no matter how powerful, means nothing if it ends in silence. And Jasmine Crockett understood that better than anyone. She didn't fight for applause. She fought for momentum. She knew that if the nation walked away thinking the battle was over, then everything she exposed would rot quietly under the weight of forgotten headlines. So she did what only the bravest warriors do after the war smoke clears. She looked into the camera, into the eyes of a country still stunned, and she refused to let them off the hook. "This is not the end," she said, voice steady but thick with something more potent than anger. Conviction. "You saw what happens when truth is cornered. Now ask yourself, what will you do when it comes knocking at your door?" There was no music swelling behind her, no dramatic lighting, just a woman with a scorched voice, a burning heart, and a challenge bigger than any chamber could contain. She didn't speak to party lines or political camps. She spoke to everyone who had ever whispered, "This isn't right," and then gone back to scrolling. She spoke to the exhausted nurses afraid to speak up, to the fathers who wanted to protect their daughters but didn't know how. She spoke to the silent majority, the invisible allies, the unsure, the hesitant, the almost awake. "If you're waiting for someone more qualified to fight for what's right," she said, "look in the mirror. It's you. It's always been you." Every word cracked like thunder. The live feed's chat box exploded. Phone lines at advocacy centers lit up. The fire she lit wasn't rhetorical. It was real, and it was already spreading. Crockett didn't issue a plea. She issued a blueprint. She named organizations, websites, local efforts in red states and swing states, and said, "Don't just donate. Don't just post. Embed. Show up to meetings. Speak at school boards. Ask your state rep who's funding their bills. Don't just vote. Organize before the ballot." It wasn't performative. It was surgical. She knew the playbook being used against people like her, well-funded, deeply networked, relentlessly patient. And she dared the people watching not to be outraged, but to be disciplined. "Rage without strategy is a tantrum," she said, "and I don't have time to babysit democracy anymore." The crowd didn't cheer. They stood, not for her, but for themselves. And for the first time in years, it felt like something was shifting. That maybe the tired weren't just tired, maybe they were ready. The hearings weren't just televised. They were studied, dissected, replayed in classrooms and town halls. High school debate teams broke down Jasmine's cross-examinations like sacred text. College professors framed the moment as a modern Selma, not because blood was shed, but because clarity had been. Activists began printing her closing line on posters, but Jasmine warned against turning her into a symbol too soon. "Don't put me on a mural," she said. "Put my questions into law." And in that one sentence, she redefined what legacy should look like. Not in bronze, but in policy. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. In a locked congressional chamber in Washington, D.C., Representative Jasmine Crockett faces off against Supreme Court Justice Deborah Stevens in a battle that tears open the myth of blind justice. One believes in order, the other in truth. But when Jasmine exposes a ruling that condemned a black teenager to a decade behind bars, the ground beneath Stevens cracks. Minutes later, the judge confesses. Her own son, guilty of a similar crime, walked free because of his last name. The system didn't fail. It functioned exactly as designed. And now, with 42 stunned witnesses and one final question echoing off marble walls, the whole nation must decide. Is justice still justice when it only protects the privileged? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Inside the marble-clad federal courthouse in Seattle, nearly 100 young men and women, most with minor criminal records, sat in tense silence. They were flanked by wary parents, parole officers, and local activists, all gathered for a state-sponsored Second Chance reintegration forum. This wasn't a celebration. It was a performance review on their potential to re-enter society without slipping back into the system. Police officers lined the back wall, watching not protectively but critically. Skepticism choked the room like fog. The message was clear: prove you're worth the effort. At the front stood Justice Deborah L. Stevens, stone-faced and composed. Her reputation preceded her. Fair, brilliant, but icy. No warmth, no softness. She glanced over the crowd like a surgeon before an incision. Precise, detached. Order, not empathy, was her brand of justice. Then Jasmine Crockett walked in. All eyes turned. Some narrowed. A few rolled. Dressed in a sharp navy suit, Jasmine carried herself with quiet force. But she was met with coldness. Murmurs rippled. A parole officer whispered, "Let's see how long the politician lasts." A teen muttered, "She's not one of us." Judge Stevens didn't rise, didn't welcome. Just watched. From the start, Jasmine wasn't here to inspire. She was here to be tested. The silence that followed Jasmine Crockett's entrance hadn't faded. It had only thickened. She stood inches from the podium, fingers grazing its edge, about to speak. But before a single word escaped her lips, Judge Deborah Stevens interrupted, her voice slicing through the air like the crack of a whip. She didn't raise her tone. She didn't need to. Her authority filled every inch of the room. "Ms. Crockett," she said, her eyes sharp, her posture still, "I remember when you were a rising star in the courtroom, a fighter, a true believer in the law." There was a pause, deliberate and charged. Then came the strike. "But now, you're a politician, a performer. So I must ask, for the sake of this courtroom and the young people in it, are you here for justice, or just for the attention it brings you?" The words landed with force. Audible gasps rippled across the room. A teen in the third row let out a low whistle. One of the young men scoffed, nudging the friend beside him. "Fake," he muttered. Two uniformed officers exchanged glances and smirks, arms folded across their chests like spectators in a game they'd already decided the outcome of. The tension wasn't theatrical, it was surgical. Cold, precise, and deeply personal. The kind of moment where the room waits not for the answer, but for the fracture, for the crack in the armor, for the stumble that proves the doubt was right. Jasmine didn't move, but inside the weight pressed down. This wasn't just a challenge. It was a public questioning of her integrity, her purpose, her entire journey. She wasn't being asked to explain herself. She was being forced to defend the very reason she was standing there. The law had once been her weapon. Now the bench itself was being used to turn it against her. There were no objections to raise, no jury to appeal to. Just a courtroom filled with young people on the edge, and a judge who had just told them, without flinching, that maybe the woman standing in front of them was nothing more than a mirage. It wasn't fair, but it was real. And Jasmine Crockett had been here before. Not in body, but in spirit. In classrooms where her voice was too loud. In hearings where her credentials were questioned more than her arguments. In rooms where being a black woman in power meant being presumed guilty of ambition. She could feel it now. The heat behind her ribs. The surge rising in her throat. Not panic, resolve. The kind that came when your presence alone was an act of defiance. The kind that said, "You may doubt my reason for standing here, but I dare you to silence me once I start speaking." A tense breath lingered in the air after Jasmine's last word. Then, without blinking, she leaned into the mic and lowered her voice. Not out of hesitation, but because the truth didn't need volume to cut deep. "I was 17 the first time I learned that innocence doesn't shield you from violence. Only privilege does," she began, her voice like a fuse burning slow and deliberate. "It was a Tuesday. I remember because my mom always worked late on Tuesdays, and I walked home alone from school. I had a backpack in one hand and a bag of fried chicken in the other. 6 wings, lemon pepper, $5 flat. I was humming a song I heard on the radio. I felt safe. Then I turned the corner, and the world stopped." She didn't look at the judge. She looked at the room, at the officers, at the teenagers who knew that corner. 3 squad cars swerved up behind me. Sirens, lights, tires screeching, like I was a fugitive on the run. An officer jumped out, weapon already unholstered, yelling at me to freeze. I thought I was being pranked. I raised my hands, confused, scared, chicken box falling to the sidewalk. Before I could say a word, one of them grabbed my shoulder, twisted my arm behind my back, and slammed me onto the hood of their car. The metal was hot. My face scraped against it. My ear was ringing from someone screaming. It wasn't me. She paused, not for effect, but because the memory still lived beneath her ribs. One of them kept shouting, "She fits the description. Black female, dark hoodie, 5'7". That was all it took. No questions, no confirmation, no conversation. Just a silhouette and a color. I was 17. I hadn't broken a single law. I had straight A's. I'd never even skipped class. But none of that mattered, not to them. Her tone sharpened, not bitter, but surgically precise. They didn't read me my rights. They didn't call my mother. They threw me in a holding cell next to a grown woman crying into a paper blanket and left me there for hours. Alone, cold, terrified. I heard an officer in the hallway laugh and say, "Probably a decoy for the real one." Like I was bait, like my body didn't belong to anyone, like I wasn't someone's daughter. She exhaled, steadying her voice. Eventually they let me go, said they found the real suspect a few blocks over. No apology, no paperwork, no record of the trauma they left behind. I walked home that night like I was walking through glass, because something inside me had cracked, permanently. She looked down for half a second, then back up with fire in her eyes. That moment didn't break me, but it taught me something I've never unlearned. To be black and unknown in this country is to be guilty until the system gets bored. She let the silence sit. I didn't become a lawyer because I loved the law. I became a lawyer because I hated how the law made me feel. Invisible, disposable, unprotected. I went to law school with one mission: to speak in the same language that once silenced me. I didn't chase power, I chased accountability. I didn't chase position, I chased the ghosts of every child whose name never made the news. Jasmine's voice never cracked. Her composure never slipped. But the room, every person in it, had changed. They weren't watching a speech. They were witnessing a wound opened in real time, and the woman strong enough to narrate the pain without blinking. She wasn't asking them to understand. She was showing them the cost of not caring. The silence after Jasmine's story was thick, uncomfortable, unrelenting. She could feel the weight of it pressing against her shoulders, but she didn't shrink beneath it. She leaned forward, slow and deliberate, her fingers resting firmly on the edge of the podium, like she was bracing for impact. Her voice didn't rise. It cut. "Let me make something clear," she began, her tone steady and stripped of ornament. "I didn't come here to charm anyone. I'm not here to look good on a flyer or to feed headlines. I'm not interested in applause, photo ops, or political theater. That's not why I walked into this room." She turned slightly, her eyes landing on a row of teens in the third bench. Arms folded, faces skeptical, trying not to show they were listening. "I came here for one reason only," she said, "to force this room to confront what it pretends not to see, to drag the theories printed in law books into the same space where real lives are bleeding because of them, to expose the distance between what we say justice is and what it actually feels like for the kids sitting right there." She pointed gently, not accusingly, but with fierce clarity. "Because you can write all the beautiful principles you want on the courtroom wall, but if those principles collapse the moment someone poor, or black, or voiceless walks through the door, then they were never real to begin with." Her voice slowed, dropped an octave, and with it came gravity. "I didn't come here to shine," she said. "I came here to collide." The phrase hit like a verdict. To force contact between comfort and consequence, between the image of justice and the cost of its failures. I'm not afraid of tension. I grew up in it. I lived in the waiting rooms of public defenders, in the back seat of squad cars, in the courtrooms where every second of silence felt like a death sentence waiting to fall. So no, I didn't come here to elevate myself. I came here to hold this system up to the mirror and say, "You made me. Now look at what you built." There was no applause, just a long, still moment where even the most cynical eyes couldn't look away. Not because she had performed, but because, for the first time that morning, someone wasn't asking the system to listen. She was demanding it justify itself. The weight of Jasmine's words still hung in the air, sharp and unflinching, when Judge Stevens adjusted her posture, not out of discomfort, but precision. She clasped her hands together atop the bench, her voice calm, almost clinical. "You've painted quite the picture, Miss Crockett," she began, her tone cutting not with volume, but with restraint. "But if I may be honest, it sounds less like testimony and more like theater." A ripple moved through the courtroom. She continued, "This generation of advocates, you included, seem obsessed with feelings, with trauma, with victimhood dressed up as virtue." Her words didn't rise, but they struck harder for their control. "You call it systemic injustice. I call it selective accountability. You speak of harm, but I hear excuse. Pain doesn't exempt you from consequence." Her eyes didn't blink. She looked directly at Jasmine, the challenge now explicit. "You tell these young people they've been wounded by the system. And maybe some have. But what they need isn't another voice validating their bitterness. They need someone to tell them the truth, that life is hard and choices matter." A pause. "Structure, boundaries, discipline. These aren't tools of oppression, Ms. Crockett. They're the foundation of adulthood. This courtroom doesn't run on emotion. It runs on law." The room had shifted. Tension sharpened like glass underfoot. A few officers nodded slightly. One of the teens in the back scoffed under his breath, but the kind of scoff that carried confusion, not rebellion. Stephen's words weren't shouted, but they were strategic, calculated to reframe Jasmine's lived experience as overreaction, her truth as indulgence. And in doing so, they gave voice to a quiet cynicism that had shadowed every courtroom Jasmine had ever entered. That feelings are for the weak, and justice belongs to those who endure without complaint. But Jasmine didn't flinch, because she'd heard it before, in courtrooms, in campaign rooms, in classrooms. The belief that trauma is weakness and that dignity requires silence. And once again, she stood in front of a system that demanded she mute her truth to be taken seriously. She could feel it building inside, not rage but resolve, not a rebuttal for approval, but a response for survival. Because now she wasn't just speaking to the judge. She was speaking to every young person who had ever been told that their pain was inconvenient, that their history was a footnote, that their anger was too loud. And Jasmine Crockett wasn't about to go quiet. The courtroom had become a pressure chamber, and Judge Stevens' words had just turned the valve. For a moment it wasn't clear how the room would react, but then it started to split, visibly, tangibly. One half of the gallery, made up mostly of law enforcement, probation staff, and a few sharply dressed parents, leaned back in their seats with quiet satisfaction. Nods of agreement passed like coded messages. One officer muttered under his breath, "Exactly what they need to hear." A middle-aged father, arms folded across his chest, whispered to his wife, "Finally, someone talking sense." To them, Stevens wasn't just speaking truth. She was restoring order, reaffirming a worldview where structure reigned and suffering was no excuse. But across the aisle, the shift was entirely different. Subtle at first, crossed arms began to uncross, heads tilted with disbelief, eyes narrowed not in confusion, but in betrayal. A young woman in a charcoal hoodie stared at the judge like she'd just been slapped. One boy, no older than 16, shook his head and whispered, "She really said that?" The teen next to him didn't respond. He just stared at the floor, fists clenched in his lap. They weren't hearing discipline in the judge's words. They were hearing dismissal, the invalidation of pain, the erasure of everything they weren't allowed to say out loud. The divide wasn't loud, no one shouted, but the tension was deafening. The very walls of the courtroom seemed to hold their breath, unsure whether they still stood for truth or just tradition. And at the center of it all stood Jasmine, unmoved but fully aware. She wasn't just being disagreed with, she was being used as a mirror, as a warning, as a target. And every unspoken rule in that room said the same thing. Your story only matters if it doesn't make us uncomfortable, and yet discomfort was exactly what she'd brought with her. Not to provoke, but to reveal. And now, as the room splintered around her, that revelation was impossible to ignore. The courtroom hadn't cooled. It had calcified, solid with judgment, brittle with division. Jasmine Crockett could feel it in her chest. Not like anxiety, but like ignition. The smirks, the sideways glances, the way the temperature shifted after every word she spoke. It was all building to this moment, and she had come prepared. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Instead, she reached into her folder with a precision that felt more surgical than political. "Since we're talking about accountability," she said calmly, almost too calmly, "let me bring the conversation back to where it belongs. Consequences." Her fingers slid a single piece of paper from the file and held it in the air, the courtroom seal visible even from a distance. "This," she said, "is a certified copy of an appellate opinion authored by none other than Judge Deborah L. Stevens, dated May 16th, 2017. The air changed. Something ancient and judicial settled across the room, like the weight of marble being dragged across a tile. Jasmine's tone remained even. The case involved a 15-year-old black boy named Deshaun Mercer. He was convicted in a bench trial, no jury, based almost entirely on a single eyewitness statement. That statement was later recanted. Forensic inconsistencies emerged. Even the prosecutor acknowledged that the case had, quote, evidentiary complications. She took a breath. And yet, when Deshaun's public defender filed an appeal, citing not only the recanted testimony, but mishandled evidence, procedural missteps, and a lack of legal representation at key stages, Judge Stevens denied it. She didn't look at Stevens yet. Not fully. She looked at the crowd, at the teenagers, some now visibly tense, alert in a way they hadn't been before. He served 9 years before a civil rights organization re-examined the case and forced a retrial. He was released after the charges were dismissed with prejudice. 9 years. For a crime he didn't commit. Do you know what Judge Stevens wrote in her opinion? She turned the paper toward the audience, holding it like evidence at trial. Though the inconsistencies presented in the appeal are unfortunate, the procedural framework has been met. No further action is warranted. The words dropped like bricks. Even the gallery, divided just moments ago, had gone utterly still. Jasmine turned to Judge Stevens. You didn't say he was innocent. You didn't say he was guilty. You said the process was followed, that the gears had turned, the ink had dried, and therefore the damage was acceptable. She took a step closer, her voice tight with clarity. You upheld a conviction not because the facts were sound, but because the form was neat. You gave 9 years of a child's life to a system that you admitted was flawed because it didn't break your rules of engagement. That's not justice. That's bureaucracy weaponized into a sentence. Judge Stevens remained motionless. Her eyes didn't blink, but her grip on the edge of the bench had tightened, her knuckles blanching just slightly against the wood. Jasmine took another step forward. What kind of system do we defend, she asked, where the structure of the law becomes more sacred than the lives it was built to protect? What does it say about us when a person can scream for mercy with evidence in hand, and the court responds, we're sorry, but your pain wasn't submitted in the correct format? Her voice dipped now, not quieter, but closer, more intimate, as if she were letting the room in on a secret it should have known all along. We act like law is neutral, but it never is. It was written by human hands, interpreted through human eyes, and enforced with human bias. It chooses. Every day, it chooses. She turned again, looking now at the young people in the room, the ones still trying not to show they were listening, but leaning forward anyway. And the question I ask, the one no one in power ever wants to answer, is this. If the law's a sword, then who gets to hold the hilt? And who only ever feels the blade? A beat passed, then another. Nobody moved. Even the officers, arms still crossed, had gone silent. The room had stopped breathing. Then Jasmine said something not in anger, but in exhausted truth. Justice without humanity is not justice at all. It is ritual. It is paperwork. It is math pretending to be morality. She looked again to Judge Stevens. And when that ritual ignores a child's life, when it says, we did everything right while everything goes wrong, that is when the law becomes a lie. The courtroom was still dead quiet, but the silence had changed. It wasn't the silence of judgment anymore. It was the silence of realization, of discomfort, of a room full of people processing the fact that the person they assumed was here to preach had, instead, put the system itself on trial and backed her claims with the judge's own words. Stevens hadn't moved. Not yet. Her jaw was locked, the muscles along her neck tense, but her voice, so sharp earlier, was silent now. And for the first time since Jasmine had entered that room, she wasn't the one standing under scrutiny. She wasn't being tested anymore. She was the one doing the testing, and the law, or at least the woman who had once claimed to uphold it flawlessly, had no answer. The courtroom was frozen, not by law, not by silence, but by something heavier: exposure. Jasmine Crockett had just placed the justice system itself on trial, and for a long moment it seemed that Judge Deborah Stevens would not answer. She sat unmoving, her bench now less a seat of judgment and more a spotlight, unforgiving, inescapable. Her knuckles were pale against the wood. Her eyes, once sharpened like legal steel, now stared through the air like she was seeing something only she could understand. And then she spoke. Not with authority, not with fire, with something far more dangerous in a courtroom like this: vulnerability. "You want truth," she said quietly, each word clipped, not by anger but restraint. "Then I'll give it to you." The entire room tilted. No movement, no whispers, just the sound of one woman standing face to face with her own reflection, publicly. "3 years ago," she began, "my son, Matthew, was arrested." Her eyes didn't leave the far wall. He was 24, graduate student, quiet, brilliant, depressed. I knew he'd been struggling, but not like that. I didn't know how deep he had fallen until the police called and told me he'd been caught forging prescriptions for oxycodone. Several pads, multiple pharmacies. He was facing up to 5 years for felony theft and fraud. A sharp inhale passed through the back of the room. Someone shifted in their seat. Another sat up straighter. Jasmine remained still, watching. "I remember the feeling," Stevens continued, her voice flat but fraying at the edges. "It was as if the gavel I had held for 20 years had just slammed down on my own chest. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The shame hit first, then the panic. Then came the calculation." Her lips pressed together for a moment. "I didn't call in a favor. I didn't break a law. But I did use my position. I called a colleague I trusted. I made sure the case was routed through the right channels. I ensured Matthew would be evaluated not just as a defendant, but as someone in crisis." Her eyes finally met Jasmine's, calm, but stripped bare. "He got a pretrial diversion, rehabilitation, supervised recovery, sealed record. He's healthy now, he's free. And I tell myself every day that it was the right thing, that addiction is a disease, that compassion matters, that justice doesn't always mean punishment. But do you know what haunts me, Ms. Crockett?" Jasmine didn't answer. No one did. "It's knowing that if Matthew's last name wasn't Stevens, if he had been born in a different zip code, with darker skin, with less access, he wouldn't be in recovery. He'd be in prison." The words echoed without amplification. They didn't need it. "I sit here in this robe and talk about neutrality," Stevens went on, "but what I did wasn't neutral. It was intervention. It was discretion. It was mercy for my son, and silence for every parent sitting in this gallery who never had the option. I made a choice. I made the system work the way it should work, for someone who already had every invisible advantage." She paused. When she spoke again, her voice had dropped just slightly, but the edges had sharpened with it. "And that's what terrifies me, that I didn't realize it sooner, that I upheld a system that rewarded familiarity and punished difference, that I believed deep down in a fiction I helped write, that justice is blind, when in truth it sees exactly what it wants to see." The room was dead still. Even the bailiff looked away, eyes flicking to the ground as if something sacred had just been broken open. Stevens reached into a folder beneath the bench and pulled out a single page, holding it lightly, almost like it burned. I reread my decision on Deshaun Mercer last night, she said. It was a cold, calculated denial, not of fact, but of humanity. I followed the procedure. I defended the framework. But I never asked if the boy behind the petition had ever stood a chance in the first place. She placed the paper on the bench and pressed her palm against it like a gravestone. I wrote that opinion because it was legally sound. But now after what I did for my son, I understand what I was actually saying. I was saying, your pain didn't fit the rules. Your trauma came in the wrong font. Your life doesn't belong in the kind of justice we write textbooks about. Jasmine didn't speak. She didn't have to. Her silence was a mirror, and Judge Stevens was now standing inside her own reflection. I didn't see myself in Deshaun Mercer, Stevens admitted. I saw another name, another case, another file. But when it was my child sobbing on the other end of that phone line, I saw everything. I saw fear. I saw hope. I saw how much a system can either destroy you or deliver you, depending not on the law, but on how well the judge understands your life. Her jaw clenched, but not in resistance, in revelation. I have made rulings that will never be reversed, she said. Some of them haunt me, not because I was wrong in law, but because I was absent in empathy. I followed the map without once looking at the terrain. Then her voice dropped to almost a whisper. I'm afraid of who I failed. I'm afraid of the names I don't remember, but whose futures were reshaped by something I signed and forgot about by lunch. She folded her hands again, this time slower, like every motion carried weight. I didn't want to admit this in a courtroom. I didn't want to say it here, of all places. But maybe this is the only place it ever mattered. Maybe what justice needs right now isn't more armor, but more exposure, more confession. She let the silence sit with her. She didn't move to defend herself, didn't pivot into authority. She just breathed it in, steady and visible, like a woman unlearning power in real time. And as the seconds stretched, something shifted in the room. Not a thunderous applause, not an outcry, just something true. The tension didn't collapse. It transformed. Because the person who had seemed unshakable had just admitted that the foundation she stood on wasn't stable at all. Jasmine remained still. The teenagers, once slouched in disinterest, now leaned forward. And the courtroom, for the first time that morning, wasn't run by law or performance. It was held together by truth, and the cost of it. The courtroom held its breath in the wake of Judge Stevens' confession. The walls, once wrapped in the cold echo of authority, now vibrated with something far rarer, humility. For a beat, no one spoke. No gavel struck. No protocols resumed. It was Jasmine who had peeled the mask away, but it was Stevens who had shown what lay beneath it. The weight of that moment lingered like smoke after a fire, visible, inescapable. And then quietly from the back row, a man rose to his feet. No badge, no suit, just a plain navy jacket and calloused hands gripping the side of the bench like he needed it to stay upright. His voice cracked before it even began. I'm sorry, Your Honor, but I need to speak. The judge didn't stop him. She didn't move. The man turned toward Jasmine, eyes rimmed red but clear. 3 years ago, I was sitting in a cell in county lockup. Third strike, felony assault. I had no lawyer who gave a damn. No family left speaking to me. The public defender called in a young civil rights attorney who volunteered pro bono. It was her. He pointed at Jasmine, hand trembling but steady in truth. She didn't just help me file an appeal. She didn't just argue for time served. She sat with me hour after hour, making me write my life out like a story. Not to impress a judge, not to win the case, to make me face who I was and who I could still become. He swallowed hard, voice growing steadier now. She didn't teach me legal terms. She taught me language, purpose, identity. She told me, you've been surviving too long. Start living. And when I told her I didn't know how, she said, then start by writing it down. He paused, then smiled faintly. I now run a halfway house for young men coming out of juvie. I don't have her degrees, but every time I help one of them get a job or reunite with a family member, I remember what she said. You're not broken. You're still being written. The room was stunned into silence. Not out of disbelief, but recognition. Then from the far corner, a woman in a gray pantsuit slowly stood. She wore the clipped badge of a reintegration caseworker on her belt, but her voice carried no institution, only memory. "I remember that night," she said quietly. "It was winter, Tract 42, juvenile girls' detention facility." Her voice broke, and she shook her head like she still couldn't believe it herself. There was this girl, 16, just sentenced to 18 months for assaulting her foster parent. First offense. But she wasn't angry. She was broken. She'd stopped speaking, stopped eating. Her unit supervisor called me. It was past midnight. She looked at Jasmine now, her eyes shining. "You were scheduled to speak at a conference the next morning, but when I called, you didn't hesitate. You showed up at 1:08 a.m. No security, no press, no prep. You just sat there on the cold tile floor of that concrete dorm and waited. You didn't push. You didn't preach. You just sat for 2 hours until that girl finally cried, and then you listened to every word." She exhaled shakily. "That girl started therapy the next day. She now studies early childhood education. Says she wants to help kids feel seen sooner than she was." More shifting now, emotional, not physical. The officers weren't smirking. The youth weren't skeptical. Something had cracked. The room had changed. Then a voice from the second row broke, not with authority, but with raw, guttural grief. "I never got to say thank you." The speaker was a woman, mid-40s, trembling as she stood. Her hands shook as she gripped a photo, worn around the edges. "My son was 14. He was slipping fast, cutting class, cutting himself, mixing pills. He wrote a suicide note in his composition notebook. I found it. I didn't know what to do. No therapist would see us on short notice. I wrote to a dozen public officials, begging for help. Only one answered." She turned the photo around, showing a young boy with tired eyes and a crooked smile. "Congresswoman Crockett didn't send a press team. She sent books, handwritten letters, poems, printed quotes, words that wrapped themselves around my son's brain like armor." Her voice broke. "I found one taped to his mirror. It said, 'You are not your worst day. You are the fight that refuses to quit.'" She looked straight at Jasmine now, tears streaming freely. He's alive because someone reminded him that his pain wasn't shameful, that he mattered enough for someone powerful to care when no one else did. The entire courtroom was silent, less like a room, more like a church after a confession too holy to disturb. Jasmine stood motionless. She hadn't asked for this. She hadn't expected it. And yet in the faces of those speaking, there was no exaggeration, no performance. Just people, each a chapter in a story the system never wrote. But Jasmine had refused to let be erased. One by one more stood. A school principal who recalled Jasmine defending a Muslim student falsely accused of threats, showing up to the board meeting herself when no attorney would. A parole officer who confessed that his best rehabilitation case had begun not with a reform program, but with a single conversation Jasmine had on a sidewalk outside a courthouse. A teacher, a bus driver, a nurse. Each story was different, but the message was the same. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just arguing for justice. She was living it, in the cracks, in the spaces the law didn't reach, in the nights where headlines weren't written and no one was watching. And somehow in a room that once questioned her right to be there, her truth had become undeniable. The walls of the courtroom had seen many things, but never this kind of testimony, never this kind of power, not in silence, not in robes, but in proof. And every person who stood up stood not just for her. They stood because she had once stood for them. The room was no longer divided. It was unified by something wordless. An atmosphere not of victory or surrender, but of truth laid bare. One by one, the stories had peeled back the polished surface of the court until only people remained. Raw, flawed, seen. Jasmine had stood her ground not by force, but by refusing to abandon the very humanity the system had tried to suppress. Across from her, Judge Deborah Stevens sat like a pillar, that had finally stopped holding up walls and started absorbing weight instead. She didn't speak. She didn't frown. She simply stood, slowly, deliberately. And for the first time in her long, formidable career, she stepped down from the bench not to deliver judgment, but to seek something far more difficult: understanding. Her heels echoed across the floor like a metronome in a moment that had already rewritten itself. She walked the distance not as a judge, but as a woman stepping across a line she had drawn for decades, a line between what the law required and what the truth demanded. When she reached Jasmine, the courtroom held its breath. You could feel every eye locked on them. Two women, two histories, two systems of belief. But the gap between them had already been crossed, not by facts, not by argument, but by the lived weight of their confessions. Stevens didn't extend her hand immediately. She looked at Jasmine first, steady, unflinching. Then she spoke, not in defense, not in ceremony, but in recognition. I came here thinking I was the teacher, she said, her voice even but low. But I've come to realize I've been the student all along. She paused. Her next words didn't tremble, but they cut like truth should. I'm not cross-examining you anymore. I'm learning from you. And with that, she held out her hand. Jasmine looked at it. For a heartbeat, she didn't move. The hesitation wasn't hesitation. It was memory. The memory of courtrooms where she'd been dismissed before she could speak. The memory of police reports that had reduced her to a profile. The memory of voices, many of them like Stevens once was, that had labeled her too emotional, too loud, too much. And yet here was that same voice, off the bench, emptied of superiority, asking not for a concession, but for connection. Jasmine reached forward and took her hand. The shake wasn't ceremonial. It wasn't political. It was weighted. Like two tectonic plates meeting after years of pressure, not with violence, but with quiet force that reshapes landscapes. Their hands lingered just a moment longer than expected. Then Jasmine, voice barely above a whisper, but audible enough to still the very air, said, "And she inhaled slow and deep, I'm learning how to forgive, even those who once stood in rooms like this and judged me before I ever spoke." The power in her voice wasn't volume, it was restraint, not because she lacked fury, but because grace, when chosen by someone who has every reason not to give it, becomes something stronger than power. The room didn't erupt. It didn't need to. The silence that followed was sacred, not because it was quiet, but because it had become safe. Safe enough for truth to be spoken, safe enough for the system to listen, safe enough for even a judge to admit that knowing the law doesn't mean understanding justice. Stevens let go of Jasmine's hand, but something invisible had shifted between them. No longer adversaries, no longer just symbols of opposite worlds, but two human beings who had finally hurt each other beneath the weight of robes, titles, and histories. It wasn't resolution, it wasn't redemption, but it was real. And in a courtroom that had once braced for confrontation, they had delivered something far more radical, a reckoning wrapped in grace, a system paused by conscience, and the handshake that made it impossible to pretend the world hadn't changed, at least in that room, on that day. The air was still saturated with the emotional weight of the handshake, an image seared into the minds of everyone present. Judge Stevens, for all her legal steel and years behind the bench, had disarmed herself with a confession. Jasmine, long vilified as too loud, too radical, too much, had extended grace with the simple grip of a hand. But Jasmine knew one gesture wasn't enough, not when entire generations had been asked to settle for symbolism in place of structural change. And certainly not when the faces in front of her, the ones that really mattered, hadn't said a word yet. She turned slowly from the bench, heels echoing across the tile with a rhythm too steady to be performative. She wasn't walking away from the judge. She was walking toward the jury that truly mattered. The youth, dozens of them, some slouched in their chairs like folded paper, others stiff-backed and skeptical. They were watching her now, but not with admiration, not yet. Their eyes asked a question she'd seen 1,000 times in 1,000 courtrooms. Are you really here for us? Or just here to say you tried? Jasmine stopped just a few feet from the first row. She didn't climb back behind the podium. She didn't raise her voice to reclaim the room. She simply exhaled, long and low, like she was letting go of the years she'd carried others' expectations on her shoulders. And then she spoke. "You've heard a lot today," she said, her voice calm but weighted, every word pressed like a fingerprint into the air. "You've heard confessions, you've heard pain, you've heard power. But let's talk about what you haven't heard. What people like you are never told in rooms like this." Her eyes scanned the rows, locking eyes with each teenager for a half-second longer than was comfortable. Not to intimidate, to see them, to force them to recognize the fact that they were no longer invisible. You can be poor, you can be black, you can be broken, angry, numb. You can carry trauma so deep you've stopped even calling it pain. Her voice didn't rise, but the tension around it did. But you are not invisible. You were never invisible. They just pretended not to see you so they wouldn't have to care. The room shifted slightly. One girl dropped her arms from their tight fold. A boy in the back sat up straighter, just enough to notice. "Do you know how many systems rely on you believing you're nothing?" she asked, her voice gaining force, not volume. "How many politicians count on your silence? How many laws were written without you in mind, but with your body in their blueprint? You weren't born disposable, but this system treats you that way and then dares to act surprised when you don't play along." She took a few steps forward, closer to the rows of teenagers, closer to the generation that had been groomed to distrust every person in a suit. She could feel their guardedness, their exhaustion, the kind that comes from being punished harder than they were ever protected. "You've been trained to survive, not live, to obey, not think, to shut up so you don't get shot, to settle for less because someone told you, at least you're free. But freedom without dignity isn't freedom. It's just a different kind of cage." Her voice trembled, not from fear, but from the pressure of holding back everything she had never been allowed to scream in court. "And so I ask you," she said, locking eyes with a boy in the second row who hadn't looked up all morning, "if this courtroom doesn't see you, do you see yourself?" She let the question hang like a blade in the air. "Because if you don't, if you let them erase you while your heart's still beating, then the verdict was handed down before you even got here, and they win." She took another step forward, this time directing her voice across the entire row of seats. "Do you understand what it means to be alive in this moment, in this skin, with this history? It means you've already survived more than most people will admit exists. You've been cuffed by suspicion, sentenced by zip code, profiled by silence, and through all of that, you're still here. You didn't disappear, you didn't vanish, you endured." Her voice cracked slightly, but she didn't hide it. "So I ask you again, will you be quiet because it's safer, or will you be louder because it's necessary?" Jasmine's eyes returned to the young man in the gray hoodie, head still down, fingers tugging at his sleeves. His shoes were worn, his posture defensive, but his shoulders had shifted, subtly, like something was stirring beneath the armor he'd been taught to wear. She stepped toward him, lowering her voice so that it didn't command attention. It invited it. "They told me I was nothing when I was your age, just another angry black girl who would get herself killed before she ever made a difference. They didn't believe I had a right to my voice. I spoke anyway. I speak still. And now I'm asking, will you?" The room was thick with silence. And then, so softly it was almost missed, came the answer. "I'll speak." The voice was cracked, shaky, but real. Jasmine blinked, not with surprise, but with something closer to reverence. The boy looked up. It was him, the one who'd stared at the floor the entire session, the one who hadn't moved while others clapped, shifted, whispered. His eyes were red, but not from tears, from holding too much back for too long. "I'll speak," he said again, louder now, "even if nobody listens." He didn't say it for the room. He said it for himself. And somehow, that made it more powerful than any applause. Around him, something shifted. A few others straightened their backs. One girl closed her eyes and nodded, just once. Another boy, barely 17, rubbed at his jaw like he didn't know what to say, but suddenly wanted to. Jasmine smiled, not broadly, not triumphantly. but quietly, like someone witnessing a spark they'd been protecting from wind for far too long, finally catch. Because in that moment, in that courtroom, surrounded by marble walls and legal precedent, one voice had risen not because it had permission, but because it refused to stay buried. And from that, 1,000 more would come. But this moment, this first one, belonged entirely to him. The boy's voice still lingered like a match struck in darkness, raw, flickering, fragile. Jasmine had lit something inside him, and in the stunned stillness that followed, no one dared to speak. Even power, even judgment, even tradition, all stood frozen. But just when the room seemed to settle, another voice rose, older, cracked with age and remorse, carrying a weight none had expected and a clarity none could ignore. Judge Stevens slowly stepped back into view, no longer from the bench but from the human center of the room. Her robe hung looser now, like armor shed in surrender. Her voice was quieter than before, no longer wielded like a gavel, but it carried further. She turned toward the young faces before her, the same faces she'd once judged from a distance, from behind statutes and sentencing charts. Justice, she said slowly, as if redefining the word in real time, is not about deciding who deserves to be thrown away. Her fingers trembled slightly. No one interrupted. It's about creating space for someone to begin again. Not because they earned it, she said, locking eyes with a boy in a torn denim jacket, but because we all need it, sooner or later. There was no applause, no grand reaction, just breathless stillness. The kind of silence that doesn't ask for attention, but demands reflection. She turned toward Jasmine, her gaze now stripped of all the courtroom hierarchy it once wore. And maybe, she whispered, maybe I forgot that. But it wasn't about Stevens anymore. Jasmine stepped forward, not to reclaim the moment, but to root it. She spoke, her voice steady but ignited. We talk about justice like it's something that lives in this room, in robes, in rulings, in rules. But I've seen too many truths ignored because they didn't wear a tie. I've seen too many kids get thrown away because they didn't speak with the right accent or come from the right zip code. She paused, letting her words settle into every fold of the courtroom walls. Justice, she said, doesn't sit on a bench. It walks into schoolyards, into homes, into hearts. It lives or dies in the choices you make when no one's watching. Not when you're told what to do, but when you decide who you are. Her eyes moved back to the row of students, her voice dropping just a shade into something quieter, something almost sacred. Every time you choose to speak instead of swallow your pain, you practice justice. Every time you listen to someone who's been silenced, you protect justice. And every time you show up, even when the world told you you didn't belong, you are justice. She didn't need to shout, because the silence that followed was louder than any cheer. Dozens of teenagers sat unmoving, eyes glossy, chests heavy, the walls around their spirit cracked by truth. This wasn't the silence of boredom. This was the silence of surrender, of being seen too clearly to hide behind cynicism. A kind of stillness that only comes when people stop defending their fear long enough to hear their own potential. Judge Stevens stepped aside, as if knowing this moment didn't belong to her. For the first time, she looked less like a gatekeeper and more like a witness. The courtroom didn't erupt into applause. No one stood up. No one hollered. But something more rare happened. People nodded, not out of agreement, but out of recognition, slowly, as if their minds were trying to catch up to what their hearts already knew. A teacher in the back wiped her eyes without shame. A security guard folded his hands in front of his belt and stared at the floor, biting the inside of his cheek. A girl with braids looked at her hands like they were something newly born. And one by one, young people began to sit taller, not because they were told to, but because their posture was no longer dictated by shame. This was no longer a courtroom. It was a reckoning. Jasmine stepped back, saying nothing more. She didn't need to. She left her truth in the air, and it clung to every person like breath after a long dive. She glanced at the bench where power used to sit, vacant now, like a monument to what once mattered more than meaning. Stevens folded her robe over her arm. Jasmine folded her words into the future. And together, without ceremony, the two women walked side by side down the aisle. Not as judge and witness, not as adversaries, but as reminders. Behind them, no one clapped. Because there are some moments too full for noise, some truths too sacred to drown in applause. What filled that courtroom now was not sound, but conviction. And sometimes silence is the loudest revolution of all. As the last echoes of silence dissolved into the floorboards, something heavier remained in the air, something unspoken yet undeniable. It wasn't just that justice had been reframed, it was that people had felt it move. And in that rare space where truth, power, and humility had touched without combusting, a new question lingered. What now? What do we carry with us after the gavel is gone and the room is empty? This was never just about Jasmine Crockett versus a courtroom. It was never about proving a point or outwitting an institution. What had happened in that room, what had cracked open before their eyes, was a revelation that justice does not begin in marble chambers, and it does not end in verdicts. It breathes through people. People who rise when systems fail. People who bleed, who bend, who break, but keep showing up. Because they know the world won't change just because they tell it to. It changes because they refuse to stop demanding that it must. And that was the real battle Jasmine had been fighting. Not against a judge, not even against the law, but against the silence that allows injustice to survive. Against the myth that some voices matter more because of titles, suits, or the weight of a last name. Against the lie that fairness is fixed and power is permanent. She wasn't just there to expose hypocrisy. She was there to remind the room, every person in it, that justice is a living thing. And if we don't protect it, feed it, and fight for it, it dies. That is the lesson this country keeps forgetting. You don't need a robe to be dangerous. You just need to be indifferent. Stevens had been a perfect symbol of the system's cold efficiency. Educated, articulate, impeccably logical, and emotionally anesthetized. A woman who once believed that law was a scalpel, not a soul, that rules were enough. But then came the night her son was arrested, and in the cruel snap of that moment, the myth shattered. Suddenly, justice wasn't abstract. It had a face, and it looked like her child in handcuffs. The same fate she'd signed on to others without blinking. That was the turning point. Not the arrest, not the charges, but the fear. The realization that her child might end up in the same cell as the boys she had written off as statistics. And the deeper horror that if he hadn't been born a Stevens, if he hadn't had her last name and her network of influence, he'd still be rotting behind bars. How many mothers never got to make that call? How many sons didn't get that second chance? Stevens had learned late, but she learned. And that mattered, because it takes unimaginable courage to admit that the system you've enforced your whole life was broken. It takes even more to say it aloud, in front of the very people you once denied. That's not weakness, that's redemption. And redemption, too, is justice. But redemption requires exposure, and exposure requires voices like Jasmine Crockett's. Fierce, flawed, unafraid. Voices that aren't shaped in Ivy League halls or sanitized by status. Voices forged in arrest records, in courtroom failures, in late-night bus stops where no one shows up but you. Because that's the second lesson. The people closest to injustice are the ones best equipped to dismantle it. Jasmine didn't rise through privilege. She rose through rage, through grief, through moments when the law treated her like a suspect before she even spoke, through nights when clients cried not because they lost, but because it was the first time someone told them they mattered. She became a lawyer not to win cases, but to create space for those whose stories were erased before the first page. That's why the courtroom cracked open, not because she argued, but because she understood. She understood what it meant to be judged without being heard, to be told you were wrong before you even opened your mouth, to be told you were free, then punished for trying to act like it. And most importantly, she understood that real change never starts with power. It starts with pain. The justice system didn't expect Jasmine, because it wasn't built for women like her. Black, bold, angry but eloquent, hurt but unshaken. It was built for those who preserve order, not question it. It was built to absorb challenges, not evolve because of them. And yet here she was, not asking for justice, but forcing the room to feel what injustice feels like. So what do we learn? We learn that civility without honesty is complicity. We learn that neutrality in the face of oppression is a decision, and it favors the oppressor. We learn that justice is not symmetrical. It does not fall equally, and pretending that it does is not wise. It's violent. And we learn, perhaps too late for some, that silence is not peace. Silence is the sound injustice makes when it's winning. The final image wasn't Jasmine holding up a document or delivering a clapback. It was her standing still, looking out, not at the judges, but at the young, the unseen. The ones told their voice was too loud, their tone too sharp, their hurt too inconvenient. To them, she said, "You are not invisible." To the court, she said, "If you don't see them, it's not because they don't exist. It's because you've chosen not to look." And to herself, maybe the truest lesson of all. The point of surviving injustice is not just to survive, it's to return with a torch, to light the path for the next person who doesn't yet know they're allowed to fight back. This is the human lesson. Justice is not a place, not a courtroom, not a robe, not a verdict. Justice is what happens after the room clears. Justice is who we become when no one is watching. And the fight? It never ends in applause. It begins in silence. The silence that remained in the courtroom wasn't empty. It was charged, not with fear, not even with shame, but with responsibility. Every breath felt like the weight of a verdict left unwritten. And that's when Jasmine did what no ruling ever could. She turned to the people, not as a lawyer, not as a witness, but as a survivor with fire still in her chest. And she spoke, not to end the story, but to make it yours. "You've seen what justice looks like," Jasmine said, her voice trembling, not with fear but with urgency. "Now ask yourself, what will you do when you leave this room?" The words didn't drift. They struck like sparks in dry air. Because justice isn't something we inherit. It's something we build, brick by brick, fight by fight, refusal by refusal. Her eyes scanned the young faces in the gallery, the students, the interns, the future jurors and lawmakers. You cannot wait for the system to find its conscience. That's not how it works. You have to confront it. You have to shake it. You have to shame it into remembering its purpose. She stepped down from the podium like a general walking the battlefield, not with arrogance, but with certainty, like someone who had bled in the fight and still came back to drag others out. Some of you will leave here and go back to classrooms or offices or courtrooms of your own. But don't just sit there. Ask who makes the rules. Challenge who benefits from them. If your school punishes the same black kids for what it excuses in others, speak. If your company fires the loud woman but promotes the cruel man, speak. If your neighborhood funds police more than it funds parks, speak. If you're told to lower your voice, ask why they're so afraid to hear it. Her hand moved toward her chest, not for drama, but instinct. "I was once told I'd never belong here, that my hair was too much, that my voice was too raw, that my fire would burn bridges instead of light the way." They were right about the fire, but wrong about the damage, because sometimes the bridge needs to burn, especially if it only leads back to silence. She looked to the bench where Stevens once sat, now empty and still, like a monument to an old world just beginning to crumble. Let them remember this. You do not need permission to be powerful. You do not need to be palatable to be heard. Her voice rose, not in volume, but in voltage. This country wasn't built by those who waited their turn. It was built by those who turned the tables, who disobeyed, who disrupted, who decided that not yet wasn't good enough. I'm telling you now, do not wait for justice to be handed down. Rise up and take it. The room leaned in like a flame bending toward oxygen. You don't need to be a lawyer. You don't need a platform. All you need is to refuse to be silent when silence costs lives. Speak up when it's inconvenient. Stand up when it's dangerous. Refuse to accept that injustice is just how things are. She paused. Not because she was finished, but because she wanted them to feel the quiet. I want you to remember the faces they said were too angry, too loud, too complicated, too black, too poor, too queer, too undocumented, too defiant. Those are the faces that change the world, not the ones who follow the script, but the ones who flip the table. A single clap rang out, tentative, then another, then silence again, because they all knew applause wasn't enough. You want to honor this moment? She asked. Then do something. Vote, protest, write, testify, run, teach. Raise hell in meetings where people yawn through oppression. Be the one voice in a quiet room. Be the person who makes it uncomfortable for injustice to breathe. Because nothing changes until somebody refuses to let it stay the same. She pointed, not at anyone, but toward the invisible, to the spaces injustice hides in. Change doesn't start in court. It starts before the trial. It starts with policies, with school boards, with textbooks, with who gets believed and who gets buried. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.